saying welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for switching gears and going virtual. Thank you so much to Roanne, our wonderful volunteer, who's a master naturalist and knows so much. And I'm excited to learn about ferns. And I'm Zoe. I'm the outreach and volunteer manager at SALT. So this is one of the perks of the jobs. I get to learn about ferns too. So I guess SALT, in case you don't know, it's a nonprofit. We conserve land in southeastern New Hampshire. So our outreach program is designed to get people connected to the outdoors. So hopefully this will give you full knowledge to get you excited about the hot days of summer. So I'm going to mute myself because my house can get kind of loud, but I'll pass it over to Roanne.
Hi, good morning. Thanks so much for taking the time to learn about ferns this morning. I just want to first talk about the logistics of how we're going to use Zoom today. You can stay muted, but you can also unmute, and we can, since it's a small group, I don't think we need to utilize raise hand buttons or anything like that. If you have a question, you can just raise your hand in your Zoom box or just talk out loud. If you can't hear me, please let me know. I can try to speak a little louder or shift the microphone that I'm using today. The other thing is, since you do have a packet and materials in front of you, I'll guide you with the numbers of the specimen labels when I'm talking about a point that you can observe in real time. If you're not using live specimens today, there was a PDF sent out to you that has the same specimen numbers. So if we're talking about a sensitive fern, the code number would be number 3. So I'll make sure that everyone can find the specimen they need before we start talking so they can see that in real time. The packet that I gave you was a bit, piecemealed in the sense that I wanted to give you as much as I could for terms, for keys, for helpful hints. So if anyone at the end has any questions about the packet, I'm going to save, I don't think we need to really talk about reproduction and some of the, have a botany lesson on ferns, because I'd love to use this time to help you ID and learn what to look for when you're out in the field, since we have a short amount of time this morning. But if we get through ID questions and you have some more just, fern botany or natural history questions, we can definitely dive into that. But I just want to make sure that you can leave this time and feel confident going out into the field and knowing how to use a dichotomous key, which the people who picked up packets have a large key. I have to scan that for friends who do not have that key, and I will send you a PDF of that. But I think the things we'll cover will help you enough without going through that. Does anyone have any questions to start off with before we jump in? Okay, so I am going to start with a little quote, because I am always so surprised with people's love and the depth of knowledge they have with ferns. And I have many guidebooks, and in the resource section of your packet, you'll see different write-ups and PDFs of books that I recommend. But one of my favorite books, it was published in 1899 for the first time. And it's by Frances Theodora Parsons, and she was a naturalist. And it's really written in that conversation style of the 19th century. And she writes, To me, the greatest charm the ferns possess is that of their surroundings. No other plants know so well how to choose their haunts. If you wish to know the ferns, you must follow them into nature's most sacred retreats, in remote, tangled swamps, overhanging the swift, noiseless brook in the heart of the forest, close to the rush of foaming waterfalls in depths of some dark ravine, or perhaps high on mountain ledges, where the air is purer and the world wider, and life more beautiful than we fancied. These wild, graceful things are most at home. And I really just appreciate how she, in her book, invites people into these, like, you know, pack your bag, put a sandwich in your pocket, and adventure off to get to know these ferns. So I wish we could do that in person, but we'll do that virtually now. So that is a book that I do recommend checking out. So let's start with, if you do have a packet, and you could go to section 1 and look at parts of the fern. Because when we're using a key or identifying anything, we're going to start always by knowing the parts. So if you do have a live fern in front of you, you can pick whatever fern you're drawn to, or the one on the top of your pile. And let's kind of go through that together. I'm gonna hold up my fern for anyone who does not have a fern in front of them. And this particular fern is a cinnamon fern. And I want you to notice that the parts of the fern that have the greenery is called a blade. And the bottom portion without the greenery is called a stipe. This is important because when you're reading a field guide, it will ask you about the shapes of the blades. And with the stipe, generally you'll have hairs or like a woolly texture to it, or things growing along that stipe. We refer to the, you follow up the stipe, this area in between the leaves, we refer that to the rachis. So even though it's a continuation of the stipe, the area in between is the rachis. The whole fern is called a frond. When a fern is just emerging from the earth, we would call that a crozier or a fiddlehead. Okay. There's different field guides, you'll see the leaf portions of the fern referred to different things. Some people will call it a leaflet or a subleaflet. I like to use a pinnae and a pinule. So this piece here is a pinnae or a pinna. Pinnae if we're talking about all of them, pinna, P-I-N-N-A, if we're just talking about one. And some ferns will have another leaf on that pinnae, which we call a pinule. So the individual portion here is a pinule. And then the middle portion, how this is a rachis here, stipe, rachis, pinnae, pinule, this middle kind of, you could call that a rachis even, is called a costa. And then costule if it's on the pinule. Okay. So just trying to get familiar with the parts will help you as we talk about the different identification tools. Does anyone have any questions or anything to add when they look at their specimen, or have a question about that?
What was the other word for fiddlehead?
Zoe, are you saying something? I can't hear you.
Can you hear me? Sorry. I'm here. I'll write it in the chat.
Zoe, I see something in the chat. Okay. Zoe, can you hear me? Because I can't hear you.
I can hear you.
Okay. All right, now I can. Sorry about that.
Sorry.
The other word for a fiddlehead is a crozier, and people like to spell that differently. sometimes with a Z, sometimes with a S. You'll see that differently. In our environment, there's an edible fiddlehead, which is related to the ostrich fern. So today, hopefully you can identify the ostrich fern and its fiddle, and then you can enjoy that as a spring treat. Does anyone have any other questions about the parts of a fern? Well, before we get down. Yes, Linda.
Do you know of any really good online apps for fern, like identification or when you're out in the field? Or
I have not found one that I feel works. I feel like the plants don't really, plant finders don't really get deep enough in it. But the nice thing is we don't have a ton of ferns in our area. So the nice thing is there are two, we'll just shift gears and be organic. This identifying ferns the easy way, it's nice to just throw in your bag. Okay. And they kind of use a few different methods in here that I think is really reliable. Fern Finder covers a larger scope of ferns. It's a traditional dichotomous key. If you're used to working with dichotomous keys, you'll be fine. If you're new to them, it's a little tricky. Not as tricky as something like Newcomb's Wildflower Guide, but it's, if you want to just go out and botanize and find ferns, I think the Lynn Levine book is really a good resource. So you're out, you're looking at these parts of the fern, and if you're out in nature and you come across a fern, what tools, without having a key or anything in front of you, can you use to identify the fern? What do you think? So I feel like your best tool, identification, just comes down to observation, right? Everyone can sit and pause and make an observation, whether it's about the size, about the location where it's growing. We really need to just use our eyes and make observations. So let's start off with specimen number 1. Let's start with that. If you have it, I'll hold it up for you. If you don't have it. So this fern is a little bit, in my opinion, the name is a little silly. This is called a Christmas fern. And the way to remember that it's called a Christmas fern, one, it's evergreen. So you'll find it in the winter growing, through the snow. It's very waxy. So of all the ferns that in your specimen collection, it probably held up better than others because it has this kind of waxy, thick pinnae. But when you look at it up close, I'll hold it up, especially this one, it says it looks like a mitten. Do you see that? With that kind of thumb that's close to the rachis, the pinnae kind of makes I'll hold it this way, a mitten shape. Or they say it makes Santa's sleigh. And these are ways to look at it and say, it's Christmas fern. So let's break this down. We find a fern in nature. We notice that it's possibly evergreen, but we wouldn't know that if we were out identifying this morning. We can look at the shape of the pinnae. We can look at the stipe. And if you can hold it up, you can even see that it has these scales growing up the stipe. It's transitioned to kind of scaly hairs on the rachis. So we're observing that there is something present on the stipe. When we look at the leaves, the pinnae, we notice that they are individual. So when we ID ferns, if you have your packet with you and you go to page 6, which is called Blade Divisions or Cuts.
Our pages aren't numbered.
Okay, on the top, it should say blade divisions or cuts and then have numbers under it. So there should be an illustration.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. So when we look at ferns, the first thing we want to decide is, one, how many cuts is the fern? So if you take something like the Christmas fern, and then you take specimen number 4, which is actually 3, the Sensitive Fern, and then you take specimen number 9, which is a hay-scented fern. And I'll hold them up, so if someone doesn't have their packet, they can see. Hay-scented fern smells so beautiful this morning. You see that the Sensitive Fern here is cut very, very, very differently than our lacy fern, okay? So if you look at the pinnae, you're noticing that it still makes this kind of winged attachment to the rachis. As you see, as I hold it up, you can really see. And it comes out of the rachis in these separate pinnae. So they would call the Sensitive Fern once cut, okay? And if you look at that, if you imagine scissors cutting in one time, they're not going to the costa of that center pinnae, okay? If we looked at the hay-scented fern, you see that there is the pinnae, there is the pinule, so that's 1 cut, 2 cut, and then when you look at the pinule, there is yet a pinulette, another set of pinules. That's what makes the fern look so lacy. So if you look at that page, blade divisions or cuts, and you go to group 3, thrice cut, you can see that it is cut again. And just knowing that helps you tremendously. Let me find you a twice cut. So if you go to Cinnamon Fern, which is number 5, grab number 5. There it is. That is a twice cut. You don't see those pinulettes cut off the pinule. It is just that one. You have the pinnae, the pinule, so you stop there. It's twice cut. Okay. Does anyone have any questions about cuts of the pinnae and the fern? What were? So I'll let you take a look at those. So let's do a little exercise. Let's look at number 10, specimen number 10, if you have it. And does someone want to volunteer on how they would talk about specimen number 10? We can do that together. I don't want to call on people. Oh, Linda, I think you're muted. I couldn't hear you.
It's a double cut, right?
Yep.
It doesn't, it's very smooth. It doesn't have any, I don't even see any spores.
Yes, that's a great thing. We'll transition to that. So Linda brought up spores. So let's find our sample number 2, which is polypody. He's very tiny. And let's take sample number 4, which is the fertile frond of the of the sensitive fern. So we're in the field, we come across the fern. The first two things I would do is say, what habit is this fern growing? Is it growing in a vase form? You know, when you envision those ferns coming up and out of the ground, very vase-like, they all kind of come to a cluster on the earth. Or do they grow in a colony? Something like the hay-scented fern that you'll just see a field, or the Bracken Fern just everywhere. They're just popping up in a colony. I would make that observation first. How is the growing style of this fern? Then I would make, how are the cuts? Is it once cut, twice cut, thrice cut? Or sometimes they're not cut in any real fashion other than they say parts of 3. So our specimen number 11, which is the Bracken Fern, has 3 distinct parts. And we use, when we're identifying that, we tend to just say, oh, 3 distinct parts. That's kind of usually an option. Then we would look at the spores. So let's talk about that. How do we plant, ferns are vascular plants that reproduce via spores. So they have a more primitive way of reproduction. The spores travel via the air and then need water to then move the sperms in and get the plant to reproduce. So when we look at spores, they can either be on the back side of the fern, and we call that sori, S-O-R-I, or soridia. The sori can come in a pouch. And I mentioned in the materials list, if you have something like a jeweler's loupe or a magnifying glass or an app on your phone, there's some nice magnifying apps, you can take a close look and you can see how the sori is contained. And in your packet, you have, let's see, in the quick guide of common ferns, it talks about the spore attributes, and it will talk there about what shape the sori is in, and if it has something that contains it, which is called an indusium, which sounds like a Harry Potter spell to me. It's like such a mysterious word. And when I teach little children, they love to just say indusium. It's a fun word. So the sori is contained in the indusium. It's like a little pouch. And sometimes you can see that opening. Sometimes it looks like a little cup and it's holding these little sori inside, but they're really fun to look at. So sometimes when you're doing really in-depth, especially with the wood ferns, because the wood ferns can be really challenging, and we didn't include them today because that's a whole separate class we can do on the wood ferns. But the seeing the indusium and the sori is a really neat way to get a better understanding of that. Some ferns, like we said, the sori is on the back, and the polypody, which is specimen number 2, some of you can see those little spores. As they mature, they will come in a very like cinnamon coloring. They're quite large. And the location and the shape of the sori will help you with identification. The lady fern, which this upsets me a little bit with its name, but they describe it as, it's a lady, she has large eyebrows. So the sori and indusium are shaped like large hairy eyebrows, and she also, this particular fern has very hairy legs. So I don't know, that and the Christmas fern, I don't like to go by that, but that's in a field guide. A lot of times you will hear it described in that way. So our friend the polypody, which is, it grows on rocks. It's tiny, you'll see it in deep shade, just coming out of a little cluster of moss. It is, how many cuts is our polypody? Let's see, can anyone answer that one? Number 2, or just by holding it up? The polypody, look at it again. I'm gonna hold it up.
2 cuts.
It's actually 1, just the 1 here.
Oh, okay, I see.
There's nothing cutting off there's no pinules. And what I really like with the polypody is it kind of has, I'll hold it up, this kind of zigzag orientation. like doot, 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 doot. And its spores tend to grow at the topmost pinnae on the top. But then there are the ferns that their fertile fronds are completely, their spores are in a completely separate frond. And they call those fertile fronds. And not every set of ferns you'll run into will have those fertile fronds, but it's very easy to identify the ones that do not have spores and have a separate fertile frond. So our friend, the sensitive fern, which can grow in pretty sunny spots, that would be once cut, and it grows a separate fertile frond. And maybe you've seen these walking along the woods. This is a mature fertile frond. The turkeys love to peck at them in the winter. And this is one that you would find now emerging out of the earth. The sensitive fern grows in a colony, so you'll see them around and you'll see these little fertile fronds sticking up. Cinnamon fern, and I think in your packet you have, as part of the fern growth styles, there's a section that says fern structures along the rachis. And you see on the bottom, Mary Holland's Naturally Curious shows some of the fertile fronds. The cinnamon fern grows in a vase-like shape, but then shoots up this very cinnamon stick looking, this one's past, fertile frond. I'll find another. The ostrich fern, in the middle of this very beautiful vase-like fern, you'll find this fertile frond. So it's just the spore cases are here. And you'll see, this is specimen number 7. You'll see this would be the vase shape of the ostrich fern would be growing around, and in the middle, you would have its fertile frond. So you would not find spores on the back of that fern. You would not find spores on the back of a cinnamon fern or a sensitive fern. The royal fern, which we just talked about when Linda was telling us that it's twice cut, its fertile frond, I'll back up a little bit, shows up, they call it like a little crown, the royal fern, it crowns the top. Some of the fronds will grow this one fertile frond that has this little topmost piece with the spores. So if you see this very lacy twice cut fern growing up very, very tall, so you may not have a fertile frond on your sample, but if you look at your royal fern and envision that some in that cluster would have this little dance of spore containers at the top. So royal fern, cinnamon fern, sensitive fern, ostrich fern, they all have a separate fertile frond. Then there's my favorite fern, which is the interrupted fern, where you'll see some of its, this is specimen number 8, some of its beautiful fronds will then have this interruption. So pinnae, you look along this rachis, and what do you find? Oh, there are these little feathery spores.
Spores
Just
all over my computer.
Just interrupting the fern. So this one's a really easy one. You go across the woods, oh look, interruption of the spores on the fertile frond. It's an interrupted fern. This one will grow in a very vase-like pattern, quite tall, moist areas, some sun, fairly common, especially in the mast road natural area. You'll see them along the way. And looks very similar when you do not have the clue of the fertile fronds that are interrupting, and you come across number 5, I believe. If you find your number 5, the cinnamon fern. Let's look at those together if you have them side by side and see what you think. Look at the pinnae and see how they look different or what similarities you see between the two. Does anyone want to share an observation?
Which two numbers are they?
Number 8 and number 5.
Are they both, oops, yeah, are they both twice cut?
They are both twice cut. Yep. What else can you observe? I'm going to direct your attention to the stipe and the rachis. What can you observe about the two that you have? I'm going to hold them up for people who may not have them in front of them, and you can make some observations too.
Yeah, one looks opposite and the other looks staggered.
Yep, that's a great one. Is a little more staggered. They're both at times can be that way. That's a little bit of a subtlety. The number 5, the cinnamon fern, do you see what's hanging off it? There's this wool. Do you see that?
Yeah, oh, that's, I wasn't sure that was part of the fern.
It's this. So the cinnamon fern is much more woolly. When they're both fiddleheads, they're both incredibly woolly fiddleheads. So they're a little tricky to tell the difference between a cinnamon fern and a interrupted fern when they're in the crozier. But the cinnamon fern tends to hold on to that woolly nature. Oh, you know, you can even see traces of it all the way up that rachis. The cinnamon fern also kind of has, if you put your finger across the top portion, it kind of has more of a groove. Mm-hmm. It's a little flatter. There's kind of this raised edge along the side. Separated. Whereas the interrupted fern kind of has a little bit of a square stem, like a mint maybe would, but it's not, it definitely doesn't have that raised top portion. When we look at the pinules, what I'm going to rip off too, when we look at the pinules, I'm going to hold them. What do you notice is different?
One grows up and one grows down. Sort of, no.
Well, I think the feature I'm trying to point out is this here is the interrupted fern. Look how round those pinules are.
Right.
And this is the cinnamon fern. Do you see how it's not as round?
Yeah.
I'll hold them together.
Yeah. Very subtle.
It's very subtle, but when you're looking at the whole fern growing, it's a little more, or next to each other, it's a little more obvious. But if you hold them next to each other now, with that feature in mind, you can see that the interrupted fern is rounder. Okay, so, you know, if you have that fertile frond, it's a very easy ID, probably the easiest one you'll come across. When the ferns are showing their separate fertile fronds, you see a big giant cinnamon stick in the middle. Okay, cinnamon fern. Ostrich fern, same way. If we take the ostrich fern sample, which is sample number 6, I'll hold that up. How many cuts is this fern?
Which one's that?
6.
It's sample number 6. Anyone want to give it a go? So it's twice cut. Its pinnae really narrows towards the tip. If you look at as it goes up, the stalk is very, very deeply grooved. So I'm going to hold that up. You can see that really deeply grooved stalk of stipe. It's very deeply grooved. It grows in wet areas. So if we were going to break down what we've observed this morning, our sensitive fern, which is once cut, grows in a colony, has these separate fertile fronds emerging from the soil around it. We have our interrupted fern, which grows very tall and vase-like in a cluster. It is twice cut, has more rounded pinules, and its fertile frond is interrupted on the blade. If we're talking about our cinnamon fern, it has a separate, growing in a vase-like manner, separate cinnamon stick. Ostrich fern, the same thing. Royal fern, its fertile frond is growing out of the tip of one of the, let me find him again, of one of the fronds. It kind of hovers up. So if you see a patch of these, you're coming across them, they can get very heavy and droop down, but you'll see that little fuzzy, feathery crown hovering above. And that's an ID feature for them, as well as being very airy looking. The royal fern, it's twice cut, it's very airy, it looks very different than a lot of the other ferns that you'll run into. And they can be very, very tall, like 3 to 5 feet tall. It has can be a very large fern. Does anyone have any questions with identifying ferns that have the separate fertile frond? Linda, I can't hear you if you're talking to us. I'm sorry.
The one you were just talking about is number 10, right? The royal fern?
Yeah.
Number 10.
Number 10. Yeah. So let's talk about our friend the Bracken Fern, which is number 11. And it grows, and this is one of those ferns that I would say you can identify it in most field guides because it will say, does your fern grow in three parts? 1, 2, 3. You can kind of see that. If we were going to talk about it differently, you could see that it is twice cut. In some areas, almost thrice cut, but I would say it would be twice cut. Its costa is remarkably indented. It has that very deep groove. It's, feel the base of the fern. I mean, it's much tougher. It can grow in pretty much full sun. It grows in a colony. A lot of people who go on nature walks in the summer, and if you have like horseflies and bugs around you, sometimes you'll see people tucking them in their hat. I see a lot of people hike because the bugs will circle around the highest point so they can stay away from you. So if you're walking and you come across a bracken fern, snap a little piece, tuck it into your hat, and the bugs should stay further up above your head. But sometimes you'll see naturalists walking around and you're like, oh, I found the bracken fern. The bracken fern does not create a separate fertile frond. It has spores, but it has it in a very unique way. If you tip them over, they're not quite out yet, so you're going to need to visualize this with me. Along the margin of the pinules, they'll kind of roll over, and you'll see this brown outline. So its spores are not in a circular formation like we see in so many of the ferns, especially the polypody sample number 2 that you have, or if your Christmas fern has sori and indusium on the back of pit. Everyone's samples might be a little different. So when you come across the bracken fern, it's very, you're gonna see these kind of like little upright clusters, 3 parts, can be in full sun, partial shade, grows in colonies. That one's a pretty okay, it's bracken fern. Does anyone have any questions on that? But it's, as you look at it and find it in nature, and you can see that how it's representing its spores. It's quite interesting. It's almost like it's just curled in a teeny little bit. You see that little brown outline. It's very sweet and delicate. Let's take a look at number 9, I believe, which is probably, this fern is probably in the worst condition of all of your ferns that you have. It is the hay-scented fern. It smells magical. If you ever find some hay-scented ferns and just want to tuck them into like the top of a dresser and just let them dry, it has this very subtle, lovely fragrance. They say it smells like drying hay, like a drying Timothy hay. This fern is the most delicate that is in this collection today. It is thrice cut. I'm going to hold that up so you can observe your first cut, second cut, and then to that costule here. It grows in a colony. You tend to see a lot of them. They're in the sun. When you walk up to them, you'll catch an air of that fragrance. They're generally a very bright green, but they're a good example of a thrice cut fern. The wood ferns are like that. I find the lacier the fern gets, it gets a little trickier. But there's some neat techniques. So the tools you have, let's see if we pulled apart my packet. So I'm sorry that it's not. Refer to it very quickly. Bear with me one quick moment. Questions for fern identification. It's labeled number 5. Look at that so you can be prepared when you go out into the field. Okay. So we would ask ourselves, we come across a fern, what is the shape the fern is growing? Is it a vase? Is it a colony? And there's some pictures alongside that kind of depicts what a vase-like structure would look like. How many cuts does each fern have? And sometimes people will say, how many divided? Like if you're out with a group of people who are botanizing and looking at ferns, how many divided is your fern? Or how many cuts? We know that's the language we talked about with the, 1 cut, 2 cuts, trice cuts, and that's how many times are there individual, like pinule. Then we're talking about where is the story and where is it located? Is it have a separate individual fertile frond? Then if we have a loop with us or a magnifying glass and we can do a closer investigation, we're asking about the indusium. Is indusium present? What is the container housing the story? We're asking about the shape of the blade. Some ferns, like something like a New York fern, which we do not have a sample from, it goes tiny and then it eventually tapers off tiny again. And they say it's like burning the candle at both ends when you live in New York. And you see this, the shape changes. Something like a Long Beach fern has these kind of like dip britches at the bottom. So they're going to ask you in any type of key, what is the shape of the blade? Our Ostrich Fern, which is sample number 6, really tapers down. It's going to ask you, is the stipe scaly, hairy, smooth? So you'll make observations on what the base of that fern looks like. Does the rachis have a crease? So we talked about that indentation that we really saw in the Bracken Fern and in the Ostrich Fern. Where is the fern growing? Is it growing on a rock? Is it growing in the sun? Wet location, dry shade. You can always answer a series and make those observations. Is the fern evergreen? So if you come across an evergreen fern in our environment, it could be a Christmas fern, it could be a polypody fern. How tall is the fern? That can be a little tricky because you can see ferns in different stages of development, but if you take an assessment of the area, you can kind of come up with what you think the general growth habit and height is. Is it growing in the sun or shade, wet or dry? And the last question is a little more advanced. It's going to ask you, what does the vascular bundle look like when you cut a cross section of the fern? So ferns are a vascular plant, and a vascular plant has the means to move water and nutrients through the plant. That's why it has the ability to grow upright. Trees are vascular plants, ferns are vascular plants. So when you do a cross section of a fern and you look at it straight on, you can see the shape of the vascular tissues that move water and nutrients through the fern. In a more complete field guide, like something like the Northeast Fern Guide, it will describe what the vascular bundle orientation is. And it's just like, they'll show a diagram, two U-shaped circles, a horseshoe circle, connected. You know, it's not using really any scientific terms once you get to what is the shape of the vascular bundle. Generally, it will show you a diagram or say two kidney-shaped, kidney-shaped pieces stacked on each other. And you have to look really close because you're trying to determine that a cross-section of something like this looks like two kidney-shaped beans stuck together. So it's, again, with the wood ferns, with lady fern, there's some that are like, okay, I can see that, but I would go to that last. Or do it for fun. Say, oh, I'll look at the vascular bundles of these ferns. Does anyone have any questions with those type of observations?
Can you give an example of what wouldn't be a vascular plant?
A moss.
That makes sense. Okay. Is that it? Or lichen?
Well, lichens are a complicated relationship. So they're neither, I wouldn't.
Neither.
It's a fungal and an algal and a cyanobacteria and a yeast just hanging out.
Right. Next time, right? We'll do that.
Oh, yeah, we can. That's another whole fun time. So, you know, the difference between, you know, it has those means to move water and nutrients through the plant, which lets plants grow tall. If they couldn't have those adaptions, they would still be stuck to the ground like moss and should be needing water in a different way. So we've kind of talked about in the field how we would go about making the observations that will help us identify a fern. Does any one of you have comfort and experience with working with dichotomous keys to identify any types of plants? Anyone?
A little bit.
Well,
Not much. A little.
if we were together, I'd make us all take off our shoes and we'd do a quick dichotomous key exercise of classifying shoes and answering those questions. So a dichotomous key is just giving you a series of choices. And it's like a choose your own adventure. You answer a question, it leads you to another question, and you generally just work your way through. The dichotomous key that I gave you in your packet is made by this woman named Dorcas Miller, who's so incredibly smart and brilliant and thoughtful. And it will lead you through a series of questions. So if you have your dichotomous key, and if you don't have one, I will be emailing you one shortly. Mine is laminated, but it's the largest piece that you have. And this particular key works with the Fern Finder book, if you have it. This is, I think, like a $6 purchase online. It's nice. It also has a little like measuring standard on the back. So that's always a nice thing when field guides include that. So it's going to ask you the questions with the language we just talked about. If you look at the top, it will say blade, not divided. Okay, so if you are a fern and your blade is not divided, you are an adder's tongue. This particular key is mostly formatted to Maine, but the specimens are pretty much the same for us in New Hampshire. Then it's asking blade completely or nearly once cut. or divided. So if you find a fern that is completely or nearly once cut, you would then ask yourself, does the fertile stalk extend from the base of the blade? Is there a separate fertile stalk? Is the sporangia on the back of the leafy green pinnae? So we have some of these ferns with us right now. So let's find, if you can, your polypody fern, your sensitive fern should be on there. Yep. And let's find the Christmas fern. So that's specimens 1, 2, 3. And let's go through that exercise on the fern finder. We made it to blade completely or nearly once cut. Does everyone observe, I'll hold them up, that these 3 specimens are once cut or nearly once cut? He's a little mysterious there, but let's say these are all nearly once cut or divided. And now it's going to ask us, the fertile stalk extends from the base of the blade. No, none of these do that. And you don't have the whole fern, so I'm going to answer for you. We do know that there is a separate fertile frond, a separate fertile stalk. Remember, we talked about the sensitive fern. This is his counterpart. So you would then be able to identify, this is a sensitive fern or a netted chain fern. And then you could look in your guide between those two. Okay, so that would identify this. It is once cut, and when we look at this dichotomous key, it is the only one that we have that has a separate fertile stalk. We've identified our sensitive fern. Now, let's go on. The sporangia is on the back of the leafy green pinnae. Yes, look, we have some sporangia, some sori on the back of our Christmas fern. And yes, we have this on our polypody. Okay, now we're going to look at the next question. Is the pinnae attached to the rachis broadly? And it shows a diagram. I'm going to hold this up so our friends can see that. See this diagram here? It's saying, is it attached to it broadly? And it shows that it's, the base is connected. And then I would say if we were talking about our polypody, oh, look how broad that attachment is. It's not attached by just a small little piece like this. Right? So now we would answer that question. The pinnae attached to the rachis broadly, yes. Our polypody is that. And then it will ask you, is the frond less than 3 inches wide or greater than 5 inches wide? It is less than 3 inches wide, so this is a common polypody. We identified our second fern. We still have a fern that falls into that category because this Christmas, we know it's a Christmas fern, but it is not attached broadly to the rachis or the costa, depending where you are. So it's saying, does it attach at a point? Yes, it does. Is the sori round and is the stipe and rachis heavily scaled? I'm going to get my loop. Yes, the sori is round. Yes, it is incredibly scaly. We follow that over. It is a Christmas fern. So we identified our third fern with our dichotomous key. The other choice with that rachis heavily scaled was, is the stipe and rachis scaleless? So sometimes you have to look at multiple ferns in a group. And sometimes, even if you get it down to these 2 choices, you can always then, it's giving you the specific page number in the fern finder, or if you're looking in a different guide, you can look up those 2 names and look at a visualization and say, oh, it's this, because a Christmas fern and a maidenhair fern looks so incredibly different. So it would be very quick, but you've at least narrowed it down. So just narrowing things down, making observations, and just sometimes, especially with something like a wildflower dichotomous key, those are really hard. And you just have to slow it down and make the one observation and then the next. You only have to answer that first question. And when you break it down that way, it makes it a lot easier. Does anyone have any questions on how we can use a dichotomous key in the field? Okay. Is there any just general questions before we do two last little things? Anyone have any questions? It's really nice to get a sample of ferns and press them and label them and have that. You can mount them with, you know, vinyl or like peel away like contact paper. And then you can study them, and once you have them labeled, have a collection. Just be mindful to pick from an area that you see many ferns, and try to keep your footprint as light as possible. But I really think it's important to take the time, especially the ferns that do have sori on the back, to be able to take a sample of that and look at it under a microscope or a magnifying glass or a hand lens is really valuable. And you know, especially to see that indusium and sori, and then that opens yourself up to whole parts of field guides where they're showcasing that and asking you those questions. And it's just a really fun thing to look at. It really helps you understand the differences of the ferns. At the Mast Road, and I'm going back today to do later afternoon to do a little bit more tagging because the storm kind of hurt some of our specimens that I tagged earlier in the week. And I have to just finalize the Google walk. So when you go to the Mast Road area, you will find specimens that are tagged with pink tape and will have taped to them a little note card that will be laminated. And that is a specimen that you can try to identify. I tried to put the laminated pieces behind so you wouldn't just go, oh, this is a tagged you know, sensitive fern. And ask yourself the questions that we talked about today, and bring your key and see if you can identify those ferns. The laminated piece will then say the name of the fern. So let's say you come across an ostrich fern. It will say twice cut, separate fertile frond goes in the center of the vase, pinnae narrow to the top, fern grows in a vase-like shape, stalk is deeply grooved, grows in wet areas. So on that piece, it will tell you the fern, but then it will give you kind of the clues of what you can observe to make that identification. I find it helpful to have, you know, break it down into those questions again. So you'll find that. I'm also going to send you a little QR code, these little, sometimes you see them, they look like a little pattern square code, and you can scan that in your phone and it will bring up a Google map and you will see the specimens. Some people's location services and cell signal at the location may be off. I've had different luck on different days. So it's not, I have the laminated tagged old-fashioned way, just so you still can, if your technology is not there, or if you don't want to deal, you're out in nature and you don't want to deal with technology, you don't need to. That's a new world of trying to do online naturalists and field walks. I'm trying new things. And technology is not my normal go-to. So I'll do it if I have to, but I'm a book, pen and paper type of girl. Does anyone have any questions about that? Yeah,
We
Linda.
wanted to bring some into our yard.
Mhm.
if we just cut off the spores, is that enough? Or how would you bring some of these into your own woods or yard?
They have a lot of spores for a reason, right? It's a little bit of a broadcast it to the wind and hope for luck. And not all locations is the ideal favorable magic time. So I think if you really wanted a fern, I would go to a plant nursery and purchase a fern. And because even, I'm not recommending going into nature and abducting ferns for your own yard. But even if you wanted to do that, the success rate is not very good. So then you'll just have a dead fern and a guilty conscience, and no one really wants that. So there are a lot of great woodland nurseries. Van Berkom in Deerfield, New Hampshire is probably my absolute favorite. They have days where it's open to non-wholesale people, and they have a phenomenal collection of very well-grown ferns. When you're at a plant nursery, go with the smaller, more denser clump. Don't look for the bigger leaves. It will have more stress when you go to plant it. So look for a nice, compact, young, ready to go. Earlier, the better.
What was the name of that nursery?
Van Berkom. And I feel like they grow native plants that, sometimes you'll come across their plants and they don't look as, maybe as large as some of the other plants, but they are grown so strong. Their roots and hardiness are just there. And I can't recommend them enough.
I find a lot of nurseries, they force stuff to bloom, so you'll buy it, and when you get it, it doesn't, it's weak.
Yeah. So I would say the ferns, look at your conditions, look at your soil quality, how much water, how much shade, and then height, because some of these ferns, especially something like ostrich, cinnamon, and interrupted, they can get up to 5 feet, 3.5 feet. So it's a very, can be big and showy. Just make sure you have the room, because when you plant them too close together and they're trying to do that, it loses so it seems hard sometimes, these tiny little things, give them the room that they are asking you for. They will be very happy. And especially the ones that do grow in a colony form, that little rhizome's gonna spread, do its thing under the ground, and you'll have many in no time. So,
great.
Any other questions?
So just on that note, I just want to say, be careful what you wish for, because my yard is overrun with bracken, and they want to grow in a colony, and I don't want them in a colony.
Yeah.
And they're the hardest things to remove. So I do have some beautiful ostrich as well, but those behave, but the bracken, they come up everywhere. So be careful what you bring in.
It's true. So colony fern. Mm-hmm. Colony ferns can be a little tricky, and they Bracken Fern and Scented Fern are not going to be, it's really not good for the canopy of trees. So you don't want to just let them loose.
No.
Any other questions? I see something in the chat. Is there something? Okay. And then let's look at the resource page. If you haven't, we'll go over that really quickly, because I think having the right literature and tools is just so helpful. Fern Finder I'll open a page for you. It's a pretty compact, there's a lot to it. It's a big key, but the nice thing about Fern Finder is it matches the key I gave you. So the page numbers go together. So it's a nice pair together. If you're out using this in the field, it's always nice to just keep this in your backpack or your bag. So if you have a question, you can go deeper with this. So I recommend that in conjunction. If you want to get into deep Northeast ferns, talking about vascular bundles, talking about, I'll show you what I do like, is it kind of gives the placement of the sori and the indusium. Do you see how this indusium kind of makes the sori It's like a flat pancake, and the sori is coming out of the sides there. So they'll give you, and then here, they give you a little orientation of the vascular bundle. They say, oh, when you cut that stipe, that's the orientation of that vascular bundle there. So it gives you a lot, and the nice thing about this book, it also gives you, if you think you found this, you really may have found these 5 things instead, which is always really, really nice, because you can just then say, okay, it doesn't quite match up with this. Let me turn to that page and start the process along there. So it's nice when you go deeper into ferns. This is a great book. It's really well organized. How to Know the Ferns is just sweet. It is sweet, but it still packs a ton of botanical knowledge. The illustrations are just beautiful, simple, magical. Look at that, Wodesia. She's showing the different types of veins, their drawings. It's lovely, but not necessarily what, if you had to pick one book that was going to help you find, like, I need to ID this. It's not that. This would be the book that I'd say for beginners is good, but it kind of gets you into maybe a little bit, not to say bad habits, but you're able to do it very quick. So it's showing you that illustration I give credit to with the cuts is from this particular book. She goes on to give you a little key of where she's calling things, in this guide, we use the word leaflet. In other guides, you will see pinnae. She kind of breaks it down into what you might see differently. But she uses silhouettes. And I find this is helpful. She'll have a bunch of silhouettes and she'll say group 1, once cut, and then show the silhouettes and the page number. So you could then very easily say, okay, this is a silhouette. It is once cut, and then try to match. Okay, so then she has something that says group 2A, twice cut vase-like structures. Here are the silhouettes. Twice cut not vase-like structures, silhouette. So again, you're using that same knowledge. Vase, colony, what is the growing pattern? How many cuts? And then these silhouettes really lead you very quickly to what fern you're observing. Then it goes into thrice cuts, and then group 4, 3 parts, like our friend the Bracken Fern. Okay, so it's or the oak fern, it's asking that. And then when you get to the individual plants, so this is Christmas fern, our fern that we've talked about this morning. She'll show you what the sori and the indusium look like, the growing pattern, an illustration, and a detail of that stipe, which is nice. And then it gets broken into where it grows, tips for ID, and there's like 8 little bullet points. Can be confused with. I do love the field guides that give you that. Well, you think you found this, but maybe you didn't. Here you go. And then interesting notes, like toxic to deer. Deer cannot eat the Christmas fern. Maybe that's why we find them so often in the wintertime. Another provides a good habitat in the winter for small mammals and nesting birds. So I do like this, especially if you have children with you. I really think this lets them be like, oh, let's match the shape and kind of talk about those things, the cuts and the silhouettes and the growth patterns in ways that is very thoughtful for children. So I do like using these for that. Any other questions? I feel like we got through this. I thought it was going to be an hour and a half. We got through this really quickly. I'm happy to key out any fern with anyone, or if you didn't have samples and you want to see something up close, to use that time. But I know it's a Saturday morning and there's probably coffee and other books and all those magical things to do. So I don't want to keep people with extra time when we've kind of gone through the things we needed to this morning. I'm hoping that the key in the resource packet is helpful to you. And I can always be reached via email or through Zoe if you have any questions. We're hoping that there might be some other times to build off this and do a walk at a different salt property and observe ferns. I would say by tomorrow afternoon, all the ferns that I'll go back through and tag some more and and we'll send you that QR code at that point.
Thank you. It was
Thank
great.
you.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, would have
Thank
preferred
you.
to do it outside, but yep.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
We'll get down there.
Is there a guide to the difference of, can you identify ferns at all from the fiddleheads?
You can, and there is not a guide. And I've talked with some of my master naturalist friends about making one, because we all kind of lament about what our dream fern field guide is, which is a little embarrassing and geeky at the same time.
No, not at all.
I can share a resource that is kind of rough.
Yeah.
There are some by color. There's, like I mentioned before, the cinnamon and the interrupted fern are very similar, but there are some that are really easy. So I'll send that along. It's fun. It's a very rough document, but I'll share it with you.
One silver lining to the pandemic is I have a really back issues. So when the pool closed, I was really sick, but we started walking on flat trails, and it was very interesting watching spring evolve.
Mm-hmm.
We started in March or February, even when the pandemic started, and found trails we would have never gone on probably otherwise. And it was really fun watching spring arrive.
Yeah, that's great. No, it's and it's nice. I think by taking the time to make these observations and learn the languages of these ferns, you're connecting with them. You're creating a dialogue with the plants. And I'm a big believer that, like, to really love something and conserve them, you need to know them and have a relationship with them. So by understanding the names and how to interact with them will hopefully connect you to the ferns more.
I love the whales, but I'm a marine docent, so this is a new field for me. I can tell you about the creatures in the ocean.
Oh, I would love that.
Thank you, Roanne, for all your time.
Much. Yeah.
Oh,
thank you so much. It's good. This is an incredibly, I keep saying it's a beautiful resource, and I think it's just a really nice piece of work, and it's been really nice working with you and seeing it all come together. And I thank everyone for coming too. It's kind of gray out today, so I guess there's another silver lining, but get outside now go and observe and do all the stuff. So thanks so much for joining us, everyone.
Thank you.
thank you.
All right.